Kia ora koto katoa. Thank you for joining us on day 2 for our session on methods of the Global South. This particular session is really at the heart of a lot of what we've been grappling with here at CARE with the culture-centered approach. And it's a fundamental question of land. Of course, land as it connects to food, agriculture, but more foundationally with Tinuranga, Tiratanga, the notion of sovereignty. And really thinking through then what does a method look like within the context of community struggles, struggles of indigenous and local communities for land, for sovereignty, and in resisting sort of the neoliberal structures of development that legitimize land grab, often in culturalist terms, deploying various kinds of cultural essentialism. We have with us today two keen, amazing speakers who have both been at the heart of the work with land and agriculture. We have with us beside me now Christine Elers, who is a researcher and PhD student at CARE, doing a lot of the work on land rights. And we have with us joining from India, Dr. Ashwini Falnikar, who has worked in the Vidarbha region of Maharashtra in India that has seen the epidemic of farmer suicides with widows of farmers. So welcome, Ashwini and Christine. So great to have you here. We will have 3 prompts again for this section. The first prompt, maybe Christine, you can begin. There are just the 2 of you, so you can switch around with the prompts. The first prompt is, how do struggles for land and democratic recognition shape methods of the Global South? Christine.
Tēnā koutou katoa, I te ti, I te tā, whiri moi te ao. I belong to the tribal nations of Ngāti Kaupata, and on my mum's side and on my dad's side, Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa. Thank you for this opportunity to be on the panel. I just wanted to firstly acknowledge the battle that took place last night here in Aotearoa. The battle was a celestial battle. Western science refers to it as the super blood moon, which is a rare occurrence that we saw in our sky last night. I'll reference Professor Rangi Mata Moa's work, Living by the Stars, his book Living by the Stars, who has really sought to and is reclaiming a lot of ancient Māori knowledge of how our ancestors were guided by the environment. And in doing so, he has outlined that the battle that took place last night in the skies is called the Marama Kutia. So, as in all battles, there are events that occur that trigger off another event that lead up to a battle that takes place. And so the time pretty much in the past, say, month was a foreboding time, really kind of a ominous time where the environment tells us you can expect the unexpected. And this really set the scene, or the climate, for the battle. And the battle was between the Marama, the moon, and Whiro. And Whiro is, I guess you could describe Whiro as the deity of the underworld. And Whiro attempts to, quite often in history, Whiro hasn't succeeded, but Whiro attempts to extinguish the light of the moon and plunge the world into darkness. And so while many people last night were stayed up late in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to witness the super blood moon, some of us were encouraging the Moon, I guess, you know, to stand her ground against the attacks from Federal. And I just wanted to say also that there were three events that triggered this battle last night, and those three were Rākau Nui had to be present. Rākau Nui is the full moon. Also, the moon had to be the closest to the Earth, and thirdly, a total lunar eclipse. So without those three elements, the battle wouldn't have taken place, right? And so just metaphorically speaking, if we think about community organising on the ground, I think in terms of method, just drawing from the discussion that took place yesterday and even this morning about the delineating between theory and method, I think, in my view, method is a battle. There isn't a battle, it's not a method, right? So method isn't a sideline commentary, right? Method, you're in the thick of it pretty much. And in the past month here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and like as I said, it's been an ominous time. The climate has told us that it's an ominous time, a foreboding time. So in the past 2 to 3 weeks, we have had these events that have triggered off something that's just happened in the past couple of days. So firstly, these events that have happened are that the leader of the opposition National Party has come out, in order to lift her rankings, she's targeted Māori, and this is what they do, you know, non-European parties, people, when they're struggling in the polls, they'll pick on Māori, because that picking on us triggers amongst the supremacists in New Zealand, increases their support. So she began that about two to 3 weeks ago in Parliament. She was called out on it by a Māori MP who is in the Māori Party. The Speaker of the House, Parliament, kicked him out, and this triggered some online, some videos being posted online. And 2 to 3 days ago, one particular video that was posted online here in Aotearoa incited violence against Māori, called non-Māori to take up arms against Māori in New Zealand. And currently that video is in front of the chief censor because it fits the criteria of hate speech laws, and New Zealand's hate speech law is really weak anyway. But such was the fierceness of his video that it meets that criteria. And just like in America, when there was that storming the Capitol, you know, leading up to that, and people who weren't very clever, you know, took photos of themselves saying what they were going to do. That's what this person did online when he shot his video. He shot it in his living room, surrounded by all these objects that could be readily identified. So although the police haven't, I've checked online this morning, the police haven't made an arrest, but other Māori and non-Māori set to work identifying him, and within 12 hours they had identified him and put that online for everybody to see. So I guess the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it's well, for me anyway, it's interrelated with this foreboding time, the time that the climate, the environment tells us to be aware, to expect the unexpected. And I also think back to when Anjum Rahman, following the massacres in Christchurch of 51 Muslim people, I think back to the time when Anjum Rahman said, she came out after that and said to the New Zealand government and to the police, you know, we've told you multiple times that this was going to happen because we had been monitoring the online hate speech. We knew that this was triggering other people, that this was leading up to this event, but you took no notice. And yeah, I think can I just leave it there? Because I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so as of this morning, though, the police hadn't made any arrests of this person, although other people have identified him. He was masked up, of course, full mask, but yeah, like I said, he left clues as to his identity.
You know, it's really powerful how, Christine, you're drawing that example of sort of this kind of white supremacy, white supremacist hate, and connecting it to the broader story.
Yes.
And that's powerful in terms of a methodological intervention. Let's sort of build from there and go to you, Ashwini.
Hello, Mohan. Thank you for this opportunity. And hello, Christine. Yes, so I will start with, first of all, I want to say that, Christine, what you mentioned about how the method of the Global South really is, you really have to be in the thick of it. You can't be on the borderlines. It's really something that resonated with me. I will start with talking about the 2 care projects that I did in last 2-3 years, and one of those was with the farmers, and the other one was actually digital margins of India, but that has direct connection with farmlands and dispossession. So right now, currently in India, farmers in the states of Punjab, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh are on a massive strike, massive protest against 3 farm laws. And the 3 farm laws are, they have been phrased in such a way that they are really meant for the well-being of the farmers, and they are supposed to ensure better income for the farmers. However, the farmers who are protesting, and these protests have been going on for several months now, since last 2020 November, and the farmers are saying that they want complete repeal of these 3 farm laws. Here is one of a quote from one of the farmers who is protesting at the site from the National Herald. The farmer says that several of us came from Pakistan. At that time, we lost land and we were given land in compensation. Now, these farm laws threaten our very existence. And the reason why they threaten, the 3 farm laws threaten the existence of farmers, and that situation really speaks for farmers across the agriculture intensive states in the rest of India. But the reason why they threaten the existence of farmers is because I will explain one of the provisions in these farm laws. The minimum support price that is guaranteed to the farmers, that was guaranteed to the farmers, is according to these laws will be, that provision will be removed, which means that farmers can directly sell their produce to, they can enter into contracts with big agricultural corporations and do their farming for those agribusiness corporations. And in turn, then they will be promised some remuneration and some income for the produce that they will grow. However, the problem here is that it's not that these contracts are unheard of so far, and it is very much possible that the corporations may back off on the grounds that the produce is not up to the mark, etc., which then essentially leaves the farmers completely vulnerable to not getting the promised remuneration. This is just one of the examples in which these farm laws disempower the farmers. Now, through the field work that I conducted in the state of Maharashtra with cotton farmers, the cotton farmers in Maharashtra are right in the middle of an epidemic of farmer suicides that has been going on since 1997, and it still continues. And the farmers who, much of the farmers, 85% of the farmers in India are small and marginal farmers, which means that they own less than 5 acres of land. And farmers also are not, even the minimum support price is not really fetching them enough income for the farm produce, which leads them to be severely indebted. And the farmer suicides are a result of this severe indebtedness, extremely expensive inputs, farm inputs such as fertilizers and pesticides, etc., that are being used in modern farming, and which then leads these farmers to sell off small portions of their lands, or the land gets divided among the siblings, and even smaller portions of land are owned by these different farm families. And in order to make the most out of those small farmlands, farmers are putting in more and more inputs into their agriculture inputs, meaning fertilizers and pesticides, etc. They are also they converted their farmlands from growing millets and nutritious food that could feed their families, and brought that farmland under cotton farming, which is a cash crop. My fieldwork with the farmer widows essentially spoke of these various stories. So the farmers explained how they don't even earn enough income from their farming to feed their family one meal a day. So dispossession and landlessness here of farmers in India has multiple facets actually. One is that agriculture has transformed from sustenance-based agriculture to modern agriculture. Secondly, agribusiness corporations have much more say and power over how the farming should be done, and they get to decide what sort of inputs farmers use, which has changed the traditional knowledge systems. The currently protesting farmers from Haryana, Punjab, and Uttar Pradesh, those have historically also evidenced the Green Revolution, which took place in the 1960s, and which has rendered their lands infertile and full of harmful chemicals and pesticides. So besides the overall state of agriculture and agrarian crisis, widespread agrarian crisis in India, there are other aspects of landlessness, such as in 2005, India passed the Special Economic Zone Act, which essentially allows various businesses and corporations to purchase land in a state, and typically this land would be agricultural land that would be converted and used for setting up businesses, and the farmers who were sustaining on those lands are offered compensations. Yes, in the recent years, there has also been massive amounts of forest land that has been which is actually supposed to be a tribal reserve, which has been taken away from for various purposes. So the government continues to make various amendments into the Indian Forest Act, which then dispossesses the people living on these forest lands, usually the indigenous communities. So then coming to the prompt that the question that Mohan posed, how do struggles for land and democratic recognition shape methods of the global South? I believe that the struggles for land and democratic recognition, especially in agriculture, in the sector of agriculture, reveal the changing political economy of the state and the changing ideas of development endorsed by the state. So here, the endorsed path to development that the state vouches for is really setting up special economic zones. So more business, so more encouragement for business rather than sustenance-based agriculture. This is also evidence. So what does it reveal about the political economy of the state? It also reveals that in the last, let's say 50 years, in 1973, the contribution of agriculture to the GDP of India was 41%, nearly half of the GDP. In 2019, though, the contribution of agriculture to GDP in India has come down to 16%, which also reveals the way in which the government thinks of development. So it's not really farmer-centric, it's not really agriculture-centric any longer, even though India was an agrarian economy. It is more pro-business, it is more more corporations oriented, and which then forces farmers to also give up their lands for SEZs. Or on the other hand, the other project that I mentioned, the digital margins of India, where there were many stories shared during the fieldwork by security persons working at the special economic zones for various companies. So they spoke about how agriculture didn't support, and they decided to leave agriculture, sell off their agricultural land, and then take up the job of a security person for that corporation, for that company. So the struggles for democratic recognition and struggle for land, which are going on right now in India, really articulate new imaginaries of India that are, and these imaginaries are different from the idea of India, the India that is that represents the aspirations of the urban privileged in all senses of the hierarchies, so caste, class, gender, everything, and the civil society actors. So the idea of India that we see and hear about through all the media and communication discourses, whether it is through the noisy broadcast news media or private spheres of communication on WhatsApp and such other elite circles of communication, is not really the India that is inclusive to the people who are farming on agricultural lands or who live in the forests. And really many of the privileged Indians see those struggles for land and democratic recognition as the people, as struggles of others. They don't really relate to those struggles as though they were part of India. Most of the privileged India really wants to do away with the poorer sections who live on the margins of the country. But the new imaginaries that you hear about in through the fieldworks and from the people who are fighting for land rights and who are struggling for democratic recognition, those ideas are rooted in caring for land. And this is really what I heard in my fieldwork with the farmers, that they spoke about how farmland is like their mother. So it feeds us, and therefore you care for your farmland. You don't feed it with chemicals and fertilizers. You don't overdose on that. These new imaginaries that you hear about in the field work are also about protecting the biodiversity of the in that geographical area, and preventing exploitation of land and resources. So yes, so that's my response.
Thank you, Ashwini. Again, there is so much to ponder on from that. You talked about within the context of the question of method, then situating method within the broader ambit of law and the legal structures. The farm bills are excellent examples. So the ways in which these laws are written in to expel and exclude local and indigenous communities. You talked about the Forest Rights Act in India. It's very similar to Maori struggles in Aotearoa within the context of the legal structures being written in and written up in ways to actually legitimize the expulsion of people from their spaces of livelihood. That connects to the broader question of political economy, and as you say, the question of democratic recognition and representation, right? Whose democracy? What democracy are we even talking about? You also bring up something and within that context, you bring up, for instance, the ongoing struggles against the special economic zones that are formulated as sites of development and capital. And yet these struggles render legible particular kinds of imaginaries, right? You also point about within the context of Vidarbha, for instance, this notion of caring for land. Now, this you see in Aotearoa. You also see it in other contexts of the global south, where the relationship with land as mother, for instance, and needing to care for, offers a register for sustenance that challenges the neoliberal agroeconomic capitalism that sort of has taken over agriculture, right? And that perhaps offers a register for thinking about protecting biodiversity, sustainability, because there is ample empirical evidence now that this kind of onslaught on the land has actually led to the land becoming vulnerable. So high fertilizer land that is no longer tenable. You can't grow anything on it because it has gone bad because of the amount of chemicals that you have pushed into it, right? So you talked about these as new imaginaries, but these are also old imaginaries, isn't it? So this notion of new and old is really interesting, as you said.
Yes, that is very true. That I don't have any response for that right now, but you're right. I mean, the other the concern I feel here that the current political climate is also talking about how we want to go back to the idea of India that that we are a Hindu Rashtra, and then constructing some idea of history that that's not inclusive. So yeah, I don't know whether to call it new, old, or I mean,
Yes, and the powerful point there, Ashwini, is that, and this is the ultimate paradox, right? This is sort of a proto-fascist government that uses the language of going back, and yet it is also one, of course, just like with any proto-fascist governments, totally tied to right-wing capitalist market-based ideas in that sense, right? So this going back is at the same time erasing people's capacities to actually be sovereigns and have sovereign relationships with land, climate, and articulate justice, isn't it?
Yes, that makes sense.
So, let me move to the second prompt, which asks, what is the nature of method then amid struggles for land in the global south?
Can I just say, firstly, Ashwini, there is a lot of, I guess, connection, as Professor Mohana said, between some of the struggles for land here in Aotearoa by Māori and those that you've outlined, especially in regard to the legislation framework and the way that really works to continue to dispossess Māori from not only access to ancestral land, but by being able to utilise ancestral land. So we have an advisory group, just a local advisory group about 20 kilometres south of Palmerston North, and who have raised to the local government, highlighted that there is a particular rule in the local government's plan that is only targeted at Māori. And so it excludes Māori from being able to build more than one house on their own land, irrespective or regardless of how big the land is. And so what I've learned from the community organising on the ground is that, and even just in general experience, that when you go to those in power, to request either shared power arrangement and democracy or for land back or land use rights, more often than not, they're not going to hand that over willingly. So even if you turned up and on your best behaviour and laid out your argument, and these are the reasons why we should be able to build more than one house on our own land, they still won't entertain that. And so I think, well, they won't entertain it without a lot of pushback or a lot of battle, I guess, if you want to call it that. So I think for me, for method, from what I've seen is that there has to be a lot of push, and you need allies in order to do that as well, because those in power won't benevolently hand that over. And in terms of the nature of the method, I think in terms of strategies, with regard to collective organising, sometimes those strategies do have to be kept on the down low, if you like. Mm-hmm. And in that, I think there's also, that reflexivity to make sure that doesn't create hierarchy when you're keeping particular strategies on the down low, because, you just never know. Because that element of surprise always works, I found. And so if you let that out to one person who tells to another person, and then you've lost that element of surprise. So it's always about being reflexive that if creating those types of strategies, that they don't perpetuate hierarchy within the community organising structure, if you like. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Can I ask you a little bit on that question, because that seems like a dialectic, Christine, in the sense that you want to keep part of the strategy hidden, and part of it invisible to the structure till it actually emerges, right?
To get the most impact, I guess.
Yeah. And at the same time, you're saying that, yet at the same time, you want to do it in a way that it doesn't produce or reproduce hierarchies. How do you do that?
It's a bit of a hit and miss one, I think. I think back to a couple of occasions that I've seen on the ground where people have organised against local government. And there can be many different strategies that are going on at the same time as well. I think, so when that strategy is revealed, because it's revealed to everybody, including the structure, then a lot of explaining has to happen within the community organising group as to why that was the way it was. Yeah. And you just really need to hope that it worked. Otherwise, why would you keep it secret if it didn't work? Yeah.
So, this whole idea of secret and secrecy as method is really powerful. And then that goes into the element of surprise, right? That particularly in things like land struggles, you do not want to give the structure enough preparation time to anticipate, right?
Yes, and to block your attempts. So hence the need for secrecy. But you really do need to do a lot of explaining afterwards to your collective as to why it went down the way it went down. And of course, if it worked, then that's great. But if it didn't, then don't do that again.
So accountability in that sense is also really vital, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Ashwini?
Yes.
Did you want to jump in and respond to Christine and to the prompt?
Yes. Okay, so it's interesting. So my perspective and my response to the prompt of what is the nature of method amidst struggles for land in the global south, it comes from, I think it comes from more of a, since I was born and brought up in Mumbai, and I identify as a urban dwelling and with all sorts of privileges, doing a job in a university of higher education, etc. So my response also, I guess, comes from that point of view. And I feel that the struggle, the method amidst the struggle for land in global south lies in creating. Now this comes from what I observe and the kind of media and communication discourses that we have available around us. I feel that the method amidst the struggles for land in the global south lies in developing evidence-based narrative that can include diverse populations across and within the countries of the global south under one large rhetorical political umbrella rooted in environmental justice and social justice. So this, I think I'm being a little bit bold in saying that. I don't know. I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Mohan, but I feel that we need something that can counter this mad aspirational narrative that seems to rule all our media discourses, that sanction all sorts of dispossession. And just at the beginning of COVID, we saw such tremendous tragedy of internal migrant workers who are essentially people who left their farmlands probably back home in small towns and rural area in India, and they came to the cities to make a living, and nobody across India was really concerned, and nobody really seemed to be all that affected by that mass journey taken up by these internal migrant workers. And I feel the sanction for that sort of attitude towards everybody else besides our immediate circles comes because of the larger political rhetoric that seems to be in favor of a certain idea of development, and we really need that evidence-based narrative, because I also say evidence-based narrative because much of the media and communication discourses that we see are so almost willingly they are creating confusion, and so even with the farmers' protests, as soon as they started, within a month or two, the confusion that ensued among people around me in my friend circles, etc., were so not empathetic towards the protests, that you wonder how far it can go, that how much can we be unaware of the struggles on the ground. So I feel that the nature of method really also has to be one of continuous and consistent engagement with people who are living in the marginalized sectors in India, and it can't really be only at the time of protests or only when a certain issue is making news. It can't only be at the time of such upheavals, or when these struggles erupt, or when a protest is taking place. It has to be a continuous and consistent engagement, and there has to be robust evidence-based narrative that can powerfully capture the lived realities, and also communicate them with the people who seem to be living. So I feel that in the 80s and 90s, during the 80s farmers movement, there was this whole idea of analogy of India versus Bharat, and I feel it's not completely irrelevant yet. It's really the urban India lives in a different reality, and the rest of India lives in a different reality. So I feel there has to be that continuous engagement and evidence-based narrative that can capture again the imagination of India, that really seems to be completely uncaring towards the people who really make half of India, or probably more than half of India. So yeah, so that's my response.
Thank you, you both. I'm going to quickly summarize this particular prompt from you both. Christine, you started with noting of the connections and the importance for connections, and seeing the synergies between the Maori struggles for land here and the struggles of farming indigenous local communities in India. And you particularly pointed to the ways in which rules in local government are used, right? And in there, you pointed out something which I think is powerful, is how these rules are arbitrary, and how they are set in motion in very random ways, right? Which then connects to the point that you're making, that when you're challenging these power structures for shared democracy, the power structures are not going to turn over the rules nicely. It's not going to take place without pushback. So there is an importance of strategy there, right? And that reflexivity in terms of like secrecy as one example of strategy. How do you take the structure by surprise by maintaining secrecy, and at the same time create habits of shared participation and accountability to community. Ashwini, you talk about how do we build evidence-based narratives. This notion of evidence-based is really interesting, because evidence is used by the hegemonic structure, or the language of evidence is used by the hegemonic structure to actually push these fundamentally destructive political economies and development policies, right? So how do you actually reimagine evidence to think through evidence-based narratives? You talked about creating almost an architecture or an infrastructure of telling stories, gathering evidence across spaces, which goes back to Christine's point about building connections and drawing through these connections to build broader international struggles, which comes back to the previous session that talked about the necessity of a kind of internationalism, that is deeply local and emergent from local struggles, and yet connects internationally in terms of addressing these political economies. You also talked about the ways in which the media have been incorporated to actually perform this propaganda. So how do you disrupt that? And within that context, you said the need for continuous and consistent engagement. Now, something else, I noticed in both your accounts is how you're demonstrating this dialectic as a continuous process, which is as people are expelled from the land, then they are placed into precarious positions in the global political economy, right? So you have lost your land and then you're working as a security guard in a multinational corporation that now sits on that space. So this process of expulsion is also a process of incorporation and creating precarity, which becomes very interesting. I wonder if we can sort of use this discussion to then move into our next and final prompt, which is sort of thinking through the methodological imperatives that emerge from struggles for land and recognition in the global south. So what really would you like method to do? Christine, you said that method itself is a struggle, right? So what are the ways in which you would want to put method to use, and what are your calls for method as it emerges from these struggles for land and recognition?
I think I'm just reflecting upon the past couple of weeks, and here in Aotearoa, there was local government all over the country had been deciding about whether to establish a Māori ward in their districts. And so a Māori ward is pretty much like an electorate, if you like, in local government. So there are town wards and there are rural wards, and Māori over the years have pushed back and said, because we're a minority, the Indigenous peoples here, that even if we all voted, we just simply don't have the numbers to put up who we would like to have that represent us in local government. And so central government at the beginning of the year, around March, removed the legislative barriers that prevented and established the establishment of Māori wards. So in our community, in the Manawatu, the councillors met, and first they said that they would defer having a Māori ward until after the next election. So we all know that a deference is pretty much a vote against a Māori ward, because then the next lot of councillors, officials could just defer that to the next time and the next time. And so it took 2 weeks of collective organising and protest leading up until their next meeting, where they finally voted in favour of it. One of my reflections during that time, and also bearing in mind we were in this ominous time as well, just so happened to be in this ominous time. One of my reflections for my iwi, Ngāti Kaupata, we're a small tribal nation, and there are, say, those of us in the academy, and there are also like one person represents each of the marae, which is our sacred collective organising spaces, and there are 12 in the district. And so I think, yes, what was I saying? That really interrogating how often we speak in the communicative spaces. And so I think, first of all, recognising that there are people within our iwi that are most impacted or more impacted than others, and making space for those that are most impacted to be able to communicate or articulate the challenges that they face, because they live in the community on a day-to-day basis. So there are a lot of us that we don't necessarily live in the community, but we don't live far away. So we might be 20, 30, 40 kilometres away, but we can go back in and then we can step back out and go back to our own places, and then we can go back in and out. So that really gives us a privilege. The people that can't leave because they live there are faced with the lived experience of day-to-day discrimination. So one of the reasons why the councillors didn't want to establish a Māori ward was because over 70% of the people in 2018 of the community voted against it. And so the councillors said, well, we should really take into account the 70 or 80% or whatever people that don't want this. And so those are the experiences that the people on the ground that live there have to face daily, right? They send their children to schools who are amongst people who have got parents or families that think this way, that think that Māori shouldn't have a voice in local government, that are against fair and equitable decision-making processes in local government. So in my view, they're the ones that really we need to be creating space for to speak. And it's not like they don't want to. Oh, there's plenty that want to speak, but sometimes us academics and others just take up that space and don't even kind of, I think it's a bit of arrogance, if you ask me. Don't think that people on the ground can articulate their aspirations or their challenges in a way that's, I guess, that the powers that be, the local government people, would relate to. And having said that, they're a bit fragile. Because I always think that they're fragile. They can't really take much. I remember one of the councillors, she's going on about having been followed online and that racism works both ways. Well, it doesn't. Anyway, she's a European councillor, and they're really just fragile. They can't handle too much. So I think some of our representatives don't want to agitate them, whereas I'd say go for it. To the people that live on the ground that have to deal with this day in and day out, they should be able to say however they want to say it. And if those in power that can't handle that are all tough, don't stand for re-election next time.
Wow. Again, Christine, there is just so much reflection there, and the key point about thinking through the logics of how we organize these spaces, right? And who speaks within these spaces, whose voices are heard within these spaces, and then how do we make spaces for those on the ground, and especially those who are at the margins of the margins. Related, you also bring up another point, which is about strategies of communication and civility and codes of civility, because it seems like, for hegemonic structures, they articulate particular codes in which they will participate, right? So they dictate the norms, and when forms of communication fall outside of the norms, that's when they are not heard or can be stigmatized and erased. So, this labeling of racism operating both ways is an example of that fragility. It is also an example of how the structure sets up the rules of communication, how it should take place, right? So when you say you make spaces for voices of those on the ground, it also seems like it's also making spaces for different kinds and forms and textures of communication.
Yes, yeah, very much so. And which I have a video of one.
So we will play that.
Oh yeah. It's a short video, And there's two, one from, if you could play the one, Breeze, from Front On, which was recorded by the media. That's a shortened summary, and then play it again from behind, which is the longer version. It's only 2 minutes.
Let's watch it.
If that's all right. So
Yeah.
So that's the first video, right?
Yeah, and it's
Video.
got stuff down the bottom. That's the
Yeah.
news media outlet. Yeah, that's the first. That's a summary, and then we'll watch the full one, which is only 2 minutes from somebody recorded from their own phone.
Yeah.
So just give a bit of context. This was the second meeting at local government where Māori and non-Māori allies assembled to lay out arguments again to the local government officials as to why a Māori ward should be established to bring about fair and equitable decision-making processes in the local government, particularly when the local government is responsible for land use, for what can happen in the district in terms of land infrastructure. It's really important that tangata whenua Māori have a say in that. Yeah.
Just gonna play that.
Faces of our future teachers, our future farmers, our future doctors, nurses and caregivers, our future tradespeople, our future journalists, our future pilots, our future iwi and central government leaders. And most importantly today, our future Vanuatu District Council members. These are the faces of our future, and you speak for the community they were born and raised in. But there's one problem. None of your faces are familiar to them. These faces show the struggle it is to attend a poorly resourced school just to ensure that their language is kept alive. These faces show the pain and hurt provided by a system that was meant and built to protect them. Ka pū te ruha, ka hau te rangatahi. When one net withers, a new one is made. Let that new net be intertwined with these faces. Tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Most days.
So the speaker there, Tana, she's from the Fielding Advisory Group, and she was had brought the youth up to the table of the councillors to prove a point that none of them represented don't look like the youth, don't speak their language, Māori youth, and certainly don't represent them. And then there's the recording from behind, because that's the news media outlet just shortened her speech a little bit.
Tēnā rā tātou katoa, tai ana me tōmati Ngāti Kaupapa. First, I would like all of our rangatahi tamariki mokupuna to please stand. These are the faces of our future. Our future teachers, our future farmers, our future doctors, nurses, and most importantly today, our future Vanuatu District Council members. And you speak for the community they were born and raised in, but there's one problem. None of your faces are familiar to them. None of you look like them. None of you speak their language. None of your faces understand the struggle of being discriminated against everywhere they walk on the whenua that raised them. You see, they are underrepresented in every part of this local government who speak for them. There are currently no Māori sitting on this table. There are currently no Māori sitting on the Youth Council table. So who may I ask will speak for them? Who are they to gain inspiration from when there is no one who represents them that looks like you or speaks their language? By not including a Māori ward right now is telling them that they won't have a say now or in the future, as it's in adolescence that people determine their future health and well-being. And so let that be an inspiration for you to say yes to them. These faces also show the overrepresentation of Māori youth arrested and incarcerated. These faces show the overrepresentation of child poverty within this very community. These faces show the struggle it is to attend a poorly resourced school just to ensure that their language is kept alive. These faces show the pain and hurt provided by a system that was meant and built to protect them. Ka pū te ruha, ka hau te rangatahi. When one net withers, a new one is made. Let that new net be intertwined with these faces. Tēnā rā tātou katoa.
So Taina she lives in the Fielding community. She, like I said, she's part of our advisory group. It was her first speech that she's made. Very proud of her. And I would say that, you know, that didn't happen. We had to push to create space for her to be able to, you know, have a minute of that to present her kōrero to the council members. So I think, you know, those of us that do have the opportunity to speak regularly on behalf of it and amongst our even what I really do need to make space for others.
This is a powerful example of making that space.
Yes. Yeah.
Kia ora. Ashwini?
Yes, so I think my response to your question is also about, I mean, I completely agree about making space. Again, I mean, since currently I'm teaching in a journalism honors program, so I end up thinking more about the media discourses, and I see, although in my field work I was more, I didn't so much deal with the media discourses so much, but recently I've been thinking more about those and how they, how news tends to twist up the you know, the story to serve a certain agenda, and that has been really troubling for me. And that's in fact where the whole evidence-based or you know evidence-based narratives came about, because there is so much of fake news and twisting of the voices. So I feel with regards to making space, I think the methodological imperative is really to you know, reevaluate what we term as newsworthy. How do we, what our news routines are really like, so even let's say amid the protests, etc., we end up, our news ends up, you know, reporters end up talking to the leaders of the protests and not so much, which is where the consistent and continuous engagement on the ground really came from. So I feel that, you know, I mean, the insistence on, so what changed me was really that ethnographic research that really completely changed my understanding of the everyday lived reality of the people. And I think really when I mentioned about evidence, it was really about the evidence of the experience of realities on the ground. So So through these, it really has to be that continuous occupation to and continuous commitment to really question at every point. Let's say, for example, we talk about in our journalism syllabus, we talk about balanced reportage. What do we even mean by balance? So those ideas really need to be expanded, and when we talk about balance, we really have to make sure that those other voices that remain outside of our regular media communication discourses also get an equitable representation. And if our news media are owned by big corporations, etc., then what does balance mean in that case? That people who don't really have the means to or spaces to speak anywhere, then creating those spaces really is also correcting the imbalance. So yeah, reevaluating all of those ethics that we talk about when we create and construct those communication discourses. I think, yeah, that's definitely, I mean, that's my response to what our methodological imperatives should be when it comes to struggles for land and recognition in the global south, because it's really the power imbalance that we are talking about here. So the people who don't feature in our regular media and communication discourses should have that space to have a say, and their voices really need to be heard.
Thank you, Ashwini. So your imperatives for method actually connect very well to what Christine was saying about the question of making space, and then connecting it to pedagogy and method as practice and practice as pedagogy in your context of journalism education, as you're training the next generation of journalists, right? And really asking, on one hand, and this goes back to what Debo was saying earlier, how do you build registers for challenging disinformation? And on the other hand, how do you continue to insist on this pedagogy that focuses on listening to the kinds of voices that have otherwise been rendered invisible, have been erased, and actually rendered useless. It is not as if the farmers aren't protesting. They are protesting with their bodies on the line, literally, right? They have been camping with their bodies on the line in the face of this kind of an authoritarian state. And yet, in the dominant hegemonic registers, that voice is not registered. So how do we build infrastructures for listening? And that goes back to pedagogy. How do we address this power imbalance, right? This vast power gap between the media that control these narratives vis-a-vis people telling their stories. What you're saying reminds me of the Indian agrarian journalist and public scholar, really, P. Sainath, who talks about how little of the Indian journalism space actually attends to covering rural news or news of farmers and voices of farmers. It's all focused on urban and development. So how do we even build that space? And I guess a practical question for you for method and pedagogy is that how do you get the next generation of students interested in this kind of storytelling, interested in this kind of ethic of the everyday at the margins, when there is a much more seductive narrative of this digital, futuristic, artificially intelligent, smart India of the future, that seductions seem very different, right?
Yes, very much. And it's a struggle. It's a, I mean, we tend to live in such a bubble that it's really hard to, I mean, insist even as a practice, and to insist that students, do go out and actually, engage with the with their. I mean, something that lies outside their immediate surroundings. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Ashwini. I'm just looking at the question and answer. I do want to open up the space for question and answer. We have the joy of having Debashish and Mary with us if you want to ask anything, and then we can go to our online audience.
No, you go to the online audio. I really enjoyed listening to you both, and I have made a few points which I will actually pick up on at the next session when I have, rather than duplicate some of the things that I was planning to say anyway. So I'll keep that, but some really good points which I will hope to build on. But I think we should go on to the online questions. Yeah.
Okay, Mary.
Oh, look, I really loved it. I really, because the super moon yesterday, I saw it as I was driving from Oakuni all the way down. It was just so big, so close to the horizon. And I thought, I'm not staying up till 11:11. But I really enjoyed your story, Christine, and you too, Ashwini. Look, I really like this idea of the voices that do not register within existing communication structures, and how does that penetrate? And I loved your example of that face-to-face in the hui, with the council. I didn't even see that online, but I followed the story and I couldn't work out how come Manawatu had actually changed its mind. That's why. So I thought that was amazing. And Ashwini, it was kind of the cross thing about the digital, the seduction of the digital media. This isn't actually a question at all, it's a comment. Sorry.
No, please.
But I'm reminded that seduction promises much but never delivers.
Yes.
Yes. And so that's really important. Yeah. Anyway, so I like Devashish. I've got all these scribbly notes all over the place that I'm not going to repeat here or ask questions because I've crossed out all the things I'm going to say this hour. Yeah. So lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anis Rahman, you have the question. Anis, do you want to jump in and ask that question? Maybe I should just read it. Okay, Anis says, love the videos of resistance from the field. Thanks so much. Recently, the co-leader of New Zealand's Maori Party was removed for the second time from the parliament after performing haka. How do stories of protest culture like these challenge the international media narrative of Jacinda Ardern's government as a beacon of liberal democracy to the world, especially with her commendable efforts to sympathize with the victims of shooting at Muslims?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a great question. Yeah, well, I have my own view, which is that Jacinda's positioning is really, doesn't tell the full story of really the historical context of what has gone on and what still goes on here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. That would be my nice response.
So much in the not we said, yeah.
Anybody else, feel free to jump in from the audience and contribute to that.
Rahul had a question.
I mean, I just wanted to echo your articulation, Christine, and something that we have often talked about is that we need to be critically reflexive of the narrative of kindness, because kindness too comes from a position of power and privilege. Who is wanting to be kind? It emanates from a space of whiteness and white privilege in terms of. You come from a place of power to be able to be kind and show kindness. I think.
Definitely.
So, I mean, it's really funny because we have gone back and forth, and I think even, engaging with many activists, they have multiple readings of that particular, because on one hand, you have the really commendable COVID response at a macro level, you have the commendable Christchurch response, but on the other hand, like Christine is articulating, there are deep inequalities, and yeah.
I think, picking up on that point, I think there is a significant difference between solidarity and kindness, which is kind of charitable kind of stuff, So it's one thing to have, networks of solidarity, and quite another to be charitable, and that's where the kindness comes in. And power, clearly, as you very rightly said, is fundamental to that. I mean, so, if you have power, then you can be kind to somebody else, but not be kind to whoever you please, because you are dishing out that, the charitable kind of stuff. Whereas that's where I see, solidarity to be different. So, you build solidarity with marginalized or whoever, other communities, which is very different from showing charity towards them. I mean, and that's where really power comes in, as you very rightly said. So critically, evaluating or assessing the discourse of kindness is important as well. Who's been kind to whom?
Thank you, Debashish. Rahul, did you want to ask something?
Yes, I have a couple of points. I hope you're able to hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I just had a couple of points, and they're not really questions. They are just, I'm enthralled by these 2 points in particular from this session. So first of all, thank you both, Christine and Ashwini, for this very fertile conversation. And really the first point that I want to kind of pick up on is what Christine mentioned early on and then elaborated on later. I mean, the idea that method is a battlefield, and not only in the respect that you go to the field and there's thousands of problems that you have to negotiate with, but method itself, the idea of methodology itself is very much a battlefield, and we have to recognize that it is a battlefield even today. And there is that element of wrangling that we have to recognize and embrace. And because we were discussing evidence-based research, and Ashwini was talking about that, and you were talking about how integrating stories sort of is an avenue for that. But even as we do that, even as we talk, I would say rather comfortably about this kind of a qualitative method in which stories are able to be brought in. The ground is already being swept from under our feet by like this AI, RCT, and this like pseudo studying of choice type of studies that just completely are aiming to generate a knowledge which really is very antithetical to what we are trying to do. So I think we really need to recognize, and I think I want to have this tattooed on one of my arms, is that method is a battlefield. I mean, every NCA, every ICA that we go to, we have to go to all conferences with this notion in our heads that this is a battlefield and we'll have to fight for it. Otherwise, it's just we're gonna lose whatever little we even have today. So, so just thank you so much, Christine, for articulating it like that. I think it's very, very powerful and deeply, deeply impactful. Yeah, so that was just one of the things, and I know Mohan sort of writes about it. So I'll stop here and have him respond, or you respond, or whomever.
Yeah. Kia ora, thank you for that. I'd also, like to add that I was having this discussion with some of our collective over the past couple of weeks, and we noted how here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, they have these awards, and you can be made a dame or a sir, something like that for it, and not taking away from substantive research that, you know, people do in their fields. I'm not taking like that. But we did think, wouldn't it be great if we had some awards that said, you've interrogated the structure, we're going to give you an award for that, you know, like actually using that kind of language, because using the language of battle in battle, then let's have some awards that says here's an award for dismantling the structure. You know, because the structure itself, the government structures aren't going to give those kind of awards out, are they? You know, we're not going to say, yeah, you can have an award for calling us out on whatever. No, they're not going to do that. So why don't we do it? Give people awards for dismantling things, or for attempting to anyway.
Yes. And part of that, Christine, I think also connects to recognizing the courage and sort of the strength that it takes for people to actually stand up to structures, especially if sort of structures have the ways of rewarding, even from those within us, from BIPOC contexts, that it co-opts us by rewarding us and giving us those titles. In certain instances, like, okay, I can be a good boy and perform according to A, B, and C, and then you hold the reward dangling on my head, right? So how do we dismantle that kind of a reward system that actually works to perpetuate the colonial project, you know?
I think if the structure is awarding you, then you need another method. Yeah. The more awards from the structure, the more your method's a bit askew, on a bit array, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And the more you're being isolated by the structure or targeted, that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, because if I may, like it's just like, you know, the white structure always presents the idea of method as a struggle that has happened. It's you know, it's history, that the struggle of method has happened, and we have arrived, and this is like the end of history, and we know what the method is, and we're just going to go ahead with it. But you're right, like, we shouldn't accept that. It's dangerous to accept that.
Yeah. And it goes back to Ashwini, your point about the consistent and continued struggle, that the struggle isn't over ever, right? That it has to be ongoing. That's really powerful. You know, Francine had said something, I'm going to read this out to you, Christine. She said that you deserve one of those awards for being a leader and, you know, working with Maori in fielding, challenging the structures around Maori wards.
I think Tiana deserves it. She's the one that spoke to the councillors.
Yeah.
But thank you, Francine.
Leon is asking, and again, you know, what a powerful question. How do you tally that critique with grant funding, the need to play the game to get funding? Kapai, Leon.
Yeah. Well, you might not get that funding again.
we are facing that day in and day out, right?
Yes, Professor Mohan can speak to that. It's happening right now.
Yes. And then you end up stepping on a lot of toes in the ministry and government, and you know, part of that is recognizing that you might not get that funding. You know, it's in a very real way. So I guess at what point do you decide, like, you know, screw funding? You know, we have to do, whom are we accountable to? But then, you know, when I say this, I'm not saying that pejoratively. I'm saying that in a very sincere way, that there are times when commitment to community voice does mean that you have to say screw funding, you know? Debo?
Unmute yourself.
About this issue of funding, okay, so nobody ever gave me funding to do any research I wanted to do beyond Purdue, right? I have found, at least over the last many years, that you form alliances. At least that's what's worked for me. You know, you form alliances and you try to, it's almost, I mean, see, funding is regarded as an institutional thing. We've always thought of funding as like institutions hand down funding, right? But I have rarely had that kind of institutional situation. So all the funding that I have managed to gather to do whatever little, and it's very little work that I have done, I've done it through alliances, through relationships with people, you know, aligning with an interest that agrees with me and trying to work out if I can get funding through that. And again, you know, like the other, you know, it's a continuous ongoing process, and you very, very rarely get to do the things you want to do, but sometimes it works. I mean, that's my experience in India. And of course, in India, you know, things are going from bad to worse. So, but yeah, I think, I mean, that's a problem that anybody, you know, who wants to do work that is not rewarded instantly. It's ongoing and continuous, and there is no end to it. That's all I have to say.
Okay, we are at 12:35 here. So I'm going to come back to you, Christine, and you, Ashwini, to give you the chance to say one last sentence as we wrap up.
Thanks everybody for listening. Didn't think that I could last an hour and a half, but yes. And kia ora, Ashwini, it's nice to put a face to your articles. Just probably my last thing would be that method involves conflict and battle. And yes, I agree with you about getting that tattooed somewhere. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Ashwini.
I just want to say that it's actually empowering to hear all of you, and I think it's I mean, yes, method is a struggle, and you know, the engaging with the margins is something that takes consistent engagement, consistent engagement and commitment. But I think what really makes this struggle worthwhile is that having everybody in it. So solidarity is really is the most important part of this. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashwini. There is just one comment that came in, and we can just wrap up with that. Anis says that a vast majority of people of color academics are not even eligible to apply for funding due to the precarious nature of the contract. And of course, you know, there are a lot of precarity involved in terms of even sustaining junior academics. How do you do method and this kind of work and sustain yourself and have a source of income that allows you to support yourself and the ones that you care for? And I think those are real questions. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Christine and Ashwini. We will take a break and then be back at 1:30 p.m. New Zealand time for the next session. Okay.